Hey folks, hope everybody's doing well. I'm going to do a little video here on utilitarianism. So it's our first normative ethical theory that we're going to cover in out of chapter 7 here. So here you see I'm on the normative ethics section of Moodle. Here's the utilitarianism section. Before you watch the rest of this video on the lecture, you might take a look at this short trolley problem video and maybe the trailer from The Last Supper, as well as either Mark's hypothetical from The Last Supper. Mark is a character in the film that offers a hypothetical thought experiment about morality. Or check out, alternatively, the Avengers Endgame scene, where one of the characters suggests traveling back in time. Both the killing baby Thanos scene and Mark's hypothetical scene from The Last Supper both involve a kind of crude utilitarian moral reasoning. So they're at least helpful there for introducing the basic idea. So after you do that, come back here and finish the rest of this video. So I'm going to switch over then and share my PowerPoint presentation, starting with utilitarianism. And if you can hang on just a second, I have to remove a cat from pawing at the window over here. So he likes to try to look out the windows when I'm recording these lectures. So, okay, utilitarianism. This is one of our basic and main normative ethical theories out of chapter 7. So utilitarianism. Again, I just mentioned The Last Supper movie. In that movie, the character Mark offers this hypothetical about traveling back in time to kill Hitler before he's become the Hitler that we know, right? So he's innocent, but you're a time traveler, so you know what he's going to do, and then, should you get rid of Hitler is the question. You see the same kind of question pop up in Endgame from the Avengers movie, where one of the characters suggests traveling back in time and taking care of baby Thanos, right? So both of those scenarios involve time travel, but they also involve this, which is another philosophical issue, but they also involve this idea of getting rid of someone based on the consequences of that would have. And utilitarianism is a consequentialist moral theory. Both of these thought experiments, Mark's hypothetical and the question out of Endgame, both raise kind of utilitarian, they're framed in ways that are amenable to utilitarian moral thinking. And so some key ideas that we'll go over in this section: the idea of consequentialism, the central notion of the normative standard or the moral standard, the prescriptive standard, central to utilitarian moral theory is the greatest happiness principle, or the utility principle. Some people use that label for it. The idea of pleasure is central in utilitarianism. Really, it's I mentioned above, the greatest happiness principle. Classical utilitarians like Mill and Bentham defined happiness in terms of pleasure. Then Mill has this distinction between higher and lower pleasures. Mill is one of our examples of a utilitarian moral thinker, our main one in this section. Then the idea of maximizing utility, and then we'll talk about two different basic forms of utilitarian moral theory. So two different ways of applying that greatest happiness principle and thinking about what a utilitarian moral theory ought to look like. So consequentialism. This is not the idea, it's not particularly unrelated to this idea that, your actions have consequences, that lesson that parents all try to teach us, that to get us to think about what we're doing before we're going to do them. But the idea of consequentialism in moral theory is that what's morally relevant about an action is not the intention that the agent gives for why they perform the action, but the consequences of that action. So as your textbook puts it, and which is a perfectly good way of putting it. It's the view that moral theories should stress the results of actions, and utilitarian is our main version, the most worked out version probably of a consequentialist moral theory. Sometimes those consequentialism and utilitarianism are just used synonymously. So what's important about the consequences of an action according to utilitarianism is that the consequences should maximize overall utility. That means bringing about the greatest ratio of pleasure or happiness or desire satisfaction. Again, classical utilitarians tended to think of happiness in terms of pleasure. Contemporary utilitarians tend to talk about desire satisfaction or preference satisfaction, given the circumstances, right? So the basic idea is that when trying to figure out what the morally right thing to do is that I should think about all of the actions that are available to me in the circumstances that I'm in, and given those available actions, which of those alternatives would have the best consequences in terms of generating happiness for the most number of people, or minimizing harm to people, pain, right? And then again, we will talk about these two different types of utilitarianism: act utilitarianism and rule utilitarianism. So let's look at some of the basic ideas here. So first up is Jeremy Bentham. Bentham is often interpreted as an act utilitarian, right? And he's one of the first 19th century figures to give us a worked out version of this theory. So he says in one of his books on the principles of morals that it's the greatest good to the greatest number of people, which is the measure of right and wrong. So that's his way of stating the utility principle, or the greatest happiness principle. It's just the idea that, so here's the principle, right, that answers the question, what ought I do? It's follow the greatest happiness or utility principle. I ought to do the action that will maximize the most happiness or most good for the greatest number of people. So he goes on to say that nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pleasure and pain. It's for them alone to point out what we ought to do, as well as to determine what we shall do. On the one hand, the standard of right and wrong. On the other hand, the chain of causes and effects are fastened to their throne. They govern us in all we do and all we say and in all we think. So the idea here is that a central part of human nature, according to Mill, is that we experience pleasure and pain in similar ways, given the kinds of beings that we are, and that pain is intrinsically bad, pleasure is intrinsically good, and then they point out what we ought to do, right? That's the measure of right and wrong. So the other kind of element to this quote is the idea of causes and effects. So you need to think, utilitarians would think in terms of social causes and effects and how they generate good consequences, maximizing pleasure, or introduce harms into the world. So they're bringing about, so our actions are bringing about certain states of affairs. And those states of affairs are either generating more happiness or generating more pain, or maybe neutral between two alternatives. So Bentham had a fairly complicated way of thinking about this. Here I have listed the elements or dimensions of an action that are a part of Bentham's hedonic or hedonistic calculus. So he thought the way to do this was to measure units of pleasure and pain. That's what he means by hedonic, hedons, pleasure units, by hedonic calculus. We're going to measure right and wrong. We're going to measure pleasure and pain, and that tells us what we should do in terms of right and wrong. So remember, all these three theories, they're all presupposing some version of objectivism, right? In some kind of impartial way of adjudicating right and wrong and distinguishing between actions that are obligatory, permissible, and prohibited. Well, the hedonic calculus is a way of working that out in Bentham's version of utilitarianism. So for every action that we're thinking about performing, we need to take into account these 7 different dimensions: the intensity of the pleasure. How strong is the pleasure going to be? How long will that pleasure last? Will it be immediate and passing, or will it be a long-term sort of thing? The likelihood of the pleasure actually occurring. A key element here is that the action that you take has to be efficacious for maximizing the overall good. If it doesn't do that, then it might be a bad action to perform, morally speaking. Fourth, we need to take into account the length of time until the pleasure occurs, right? So think about working out and exercising your muscles or your diet, and how the benefit that you get from that is over the long run, not immediately, right? The fecundity, this is number 5, the probability of the pleasure being followed by experiences of the same sort rather than the opposite sort. That leads us to purity, the probability of the pleasure being followed by experiences of the opposite kind, namely pain. And then the extent of the pleasure. What are the number of people that are going to be affected by this? For utilitarianism, it's not just about my overall happiness. That's not what they mean by overall happiness or overall pleasure. What they mean is overall across a population, right? Everybody that's affected by the action, even if they are negatively affected by the action, so, or remotely affected by the action. If I buy a 6-pack of beer at the grocery store, that's $10 that I didn't donate to Oxfam and alleviate poverty for people on the other side of the world. So all those sorts of things come into play in determining the morality of an action, the rightness or wrongness of an action. So that's a little bit of a warm up there for Bentham. The main example of a utilitarian in your textbook is Mill, John Stuart Mill. And he had a criticism of Bentham's version of utilitarianism. He called it a pig philosophy. He said, according to Bentham's version, it would be better to be a happy pig rather than an unhappy Socrates. Well, the pig and Socrates are capable of different sorts of pleasures. The pig is only capable of kind of physical pleasures, right? But Socrates is capable of intellectual and mental pleasures. And so one revision to that original theory that Mill made was to introduce this distinction between higher and lower pleasures. So we want to be on the watch out for that. Also, we want to think about, how does he define justice? And how do they justify the idea of a moral or political right? Most of us walk around thinking that we have certain rights that other people shouldn't violate, that the government shouldn't violate, or that our employers shouldn't violate. So what's the justification for that from a utilitarian perspective? So I've just pulled out a few quotes here from Mill's short book, Utilitarianism. So we just saw Bentham's version of the utility principle, or the greatest happiness principle. Here's Mill on that same idea. This quotation packs quite a bit into it. So he says, the creed which accepts the foundation of morals, utility, or the greatest happiness principle, holds that actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. By happiness is intended pleasure in the absence of pain, by unhappiness, pain in the privation of pleasure. This being said, according to the utilitarian opinion, the end of human action is necessarily also the standard of morality, which may accordingly be defined, the rules and precepts for human conduct by the observation, to the greatest extent possible, secured to all mankind, and not to them only, but so far as the nature of things admits, to the whole sentient creation. So again, a lot packed in here. We get the basic idea of the greatest happiness principle. The right thing to do is to, in Mill's version now, is to follow the rules and precepts that would maximize overall utility. That's why sometimes he's interpreted as a rule utilitarian instead of an act utilitarian. And again, I'll come back to that distinction towards the end here. So we get the definition of happiness is pleasure, the definition of harm as pain. We also see that this is a teleological theory. They're talking about the ends of our action, the purpose of our action, or the results of our actions, the consequences of our actions, right, is what's important about them. And we get a criteria for moral standing or moral consideration here. So again, I've got my Bluetooth mouse here. It's mine. You might think it imprudent if I were to break it, since it's a functioning mouse and works quite well. You might think it's imprudent of me to break it if I felt like breaking it, but you probably wouldn't have a moral problem with me breaking it, right? After all, it's my property. And it doesn't, in breaking it, doesn't harm anything, right? But what if I were to break you in half, right? Or my cat in half? Those entities, those beings, are capable of experiencing pleasure and pain. They're sentient beings, right? They have sense experiences, right? They're capable of having sensations. That's what it means to be a sentient being. And so according to utilitarianism, any sentient being, whether it's a human person or an animal, has moral standing. The only criteria for moral standing in utilitarianism in this version is that it be capable of experiencing pleasure and pain. So again, quite a bit packed into that one little paragraph there. Mill reiterates this notion that what's important in utilitarianism is not the individual's own happiness. It's not an egoistic theory in this regard, saying that what's most important or morally relevant is my own happiness as opposed to others. It's overall happiness. So he says, I must again repeat that the assailants of utilitarianism seldom have the justice to acknowledge that the happiness which forms the utilitarian standard of what is right in conduct is not the agent's own happiness, but that of all concerned. So the agent's own happiness counts, but it doesn't count any more or less than anybody else's, right? So he says, between his own happiness and that of others, utilitarianism requires him to be as strictly impartial as a disinterested and benevolent spectator. So if I'm faced with a choice between, and I have to choose, right? So it's, think about possible circumstances here of being set up such that I have to choose between saving the life of my own mother and the life of 10 strangers. According to utilitarianism, I got to save the lives of the 10 strangers because that's more happiness. The fact that this other individual is my mother and I have a special relationship with her versus the other people being strangers, that doesn't get to count, morally speaking. My particular social relationships don't matter. Friendships aren't really what's important according to utilitarianism. I just relate to other individuals, other beings, other sentient beings, in the sense that they are either the possible beneficiaries of or victims of the consequences of my actions. It doesn't get to figure in that this one individual is my mom and and that I have a peculiar or particular relationship with her. All that matters is that we're sentient beings, right? And so I have to be, according to this view, impartial and disinterested, right? I'm impartial, don't take into account my particular preferences, right? Disinterested, but benevolent. So I'm supposed to be concerned with overall happiness, but in a disinterested way, in an impartial way. In other words, my particular preferences and wants and desires don't get to figure into it. It's overall happiness is what matters. So here's that distinction then between lower and higher pleasures that's important to Mill. He thinks that Bentham thought that only what mattered was the unit or the measure, the quantity of happiness. Well, Mill introduces this distinction between higher and lower pleasures, different kinds of pleasures. So he says it's quite compatible with the principle of utility to recognize the fact that some kinds of pleasure are more desirable and more valuable than others. It would be absurd that while in estimating all other things, quality is considered as well as quantity, the estimation of pleasures should be supposed to depend on quantity alone. So we have not just the amount, but whether it's a higher or lower pleasure. And then he distinguishes higher and lower pleasures based on physical pleasures versus mental or intellectual pleasures. So physical pleasures, that's common with all animals for the most part. Those are the lower pleasures. And then the mental pleasures are higher pleasures that he associates with more so with, vastly more complicated and intelligent beings, sentient beings. So he says, of two pleasures, if there be one to which all or almost all who have experience of both give decided preference, irrespective of any feeling of moral obligation to prefer it, that's the more desirable one. So you need people that are have experience with many different types of pleasures in order to determine where that line is, how we're going to distinguish between higher and lower pleasures. So back to this idea of a moral or political or a legal right. There's some overlap between those, but obviously they're different because some of them we enforce officially versus unofficial enforcement, shaming people in public or something like that, versus getting locked up in jail or something like that, right? So the idea of a right, a moral right, or a political right, or a legal right, rights to free speech or rights to due process, individual freedoms, right? He says, to have a right then, as I conceive, is to have something in which society ought to defend me in the possession of. If the objector goes on to ask why why society ought to protect that right, I can give him no other reason than general utility. So Mill, in another book on liberty, Mill's a classical utilitarian, and he thinks that he is a classical liberal as well in the classical sense, meaning that we have limited government and individual freedom, right? He thought that governments in which people enjoy forms of government, societies in which people enjoy lots of individual liberty, make more happiness than they do in repressive societies. So that was his justification for a particular kind of government as well. And so that's his justification for the notion of rights as well. He gives an impassioned defense of the right to free speech on the basis of the greatest happiness or utility principle. But of course, there are limits to that. There are limits to our freedoms. And everybody knows, I'm sure, the famous example. You have the right to free speech, but you don't have the right to walk into a crowded theater and falsely yell fire. Why not? Because it's likely to produce more harm in the world than it is to benefit the world. So you get a utilitarian justification for curbing individual freedom. It's the harm principle. So I'll come back to that as well here at the end. So justice then, right, central moral and political ideal. Justice is the name for certain moral requirements, like those rights, which regarded collectively stand higher on the scale of social utility and are therefore of more paramount obligation than any others, though particular cases may occur in which some other social duty is so important as to overrule any one of the general maxims of justice. Thus, to save a life, it may not only be allowable, but a duty to steal or take or force by force the necessary food or medicine, or to kidnap, but compel the officiate, the only qualified medical practitioner. So look, here's an example. Generally speaking, we're supposed to follow the traffic laws, right? They produce more safety when everybody's abiding by these rules of the road than when people do not abide by the rules of the road. But if it was midnight, no one else around, my wife is, and I don't even worry about whether it's my wife or not. Suppose I come across a person that's wounded in the street and bleeding out. And I put them in my car and I speed off towards the emergency room. But there are stop signs. There's a stoplight ahead and it's red. Under normal circumstances, I should stop, right? But if it's midnight, there's a red light, but there's no oncoming traffic, so I'm not in danger of harming other people, but this person's life is in jeopardy and I need to get them to the hospital. I'm going to run that stop sign. I'm going to run that stoplight in order to get them to the emergency room quicker. So long as doing so won't produce more harm in the world. So if there's no oncoming traffic, there's no people in the crosswalks that I'm going to run over, utilitarianism says break the rule. So here's how your textbook puts this utility principle, or the greatest happiness principle. Among the foreseeable consequences, one ought to always bring about the greatest ratio, or the greatest good for the greatest number over the long run. It's not just about what's going to produce the most happiness right now. It has to be over the long run. And so the textbook uses Saving Private Ryan to illustrate some of those notions. So in the film, what happens is, they risk the lives of this one unit in order to save the many more lives of the one unit to save this one guy. And so you have some utilitarian considerations to worry about whether that would be the right decision to make or not, even during wartime. So an important thing to think about here then is making utilitarian decisions, or moral decisions according to utilitarianism. Here I have an oversimplified utility test. I call it oversimplified because it doesn't take into account like all those 7 dimensions of that Bentham thought we ought to take into account. I'm just doing this oversimplified way to introduce the basic idea of utilitarian moral reasoning. So suppose we had just 2 possible actions to perform, A and B. What we would do is think about how likely is it that what are the units of happiness and pain units associated with performing each of those actions, and then whichever one comes out on the top with more harm, with greater happiness, that's the right action to perform. So here I just have a little diagram of a bit of an oversimplified utility test. If you really wanted to be a conscientious utilitarian, you'd have to think about What kind of precedent is my action going to set for others? The direct and indirect consequences of that action, and so forth. So it could get fairly complicated fairly quickly. Let me back up one little thing here. So I wanted to mention this idea of a right. And again, Mill emphasizes individual rights, lots of individual liberty, but he introduces a corollary principle to the greatest happiness principle, and that corollary principle is called the harm principle. Right? So he says in that the only justification that individuals, either collectively or in the form of a government, the only justification that they could give for curbing someone's freedom is if their freedom is going to introduce more harm into the world than pain. So it's called the harm principle. That's what supposedly justifies limits on individual freedoms, is if if those actions don't produce more harm for others, if it's just about them, they can do what they want. But the part of their action that affects society, they're answerable to society for that. So again, the harm principle curbs and it it's a liberty limiting principle in utilitarianism. So again, the action would be wrong if it produces more harm than pain. And so again, think of the justification for for fining or locking somebody up for falsely yelling fire in a crowded movie theater. It's that action is likely to produce more harm than good. So you can have justifications on individual liberty there. All right, so wrapping up this section, I got a little activity for you on utilitarianism. So there's a worksheet on utilitarianism in the utilitarianism section on Moodle. So download that and watch this episode of Rick and Morty along with that worksheet. Look over the worksheet first and watch the Rick and Morty episode, then go back to the worksheet. So this is the autoerotic assimilation episode of Rick and Morty. And in this episode, we find that one of Rick's old girlfriends, which is a surprise for us if you've seen the show to know that he had been dating, she has the power of assimilation. She can assimilate individuals into a collective. When you're watching this episode, I want you to pay attention to a few things here. First, how does Rick treat Unity and her, and what does he persuade her to do with her abilities of assimilation? Second, what kind of justification, what kind of defense, or what kinds of reasons does Unity give in support of her assimilation project? She's assimilating planets, populations of planets. What reasons does she give for doing so? Are they utilitarian reasons, right? And secondly, we think about whether utilitarianism really does justify that plan. Secondly, think about what happens when people are freed from the collective. What are the consequences of that versus the consequences of assimilation? Next, think about Summer's objections to Unity's assimilation project. She, at least initially and throughout much of the episode, objects to the assimilation project, although she adjusts her perspective at the end. So watch out for that as well. And then think about Morty's reaction to the assimilation project. Is he troubled by it the way that Summer is troubled by it, or does he seem relatively okay with it? And what might that tell us about Morty's views about morality? All right, so take a look at that episode. And one little way of complicating things here is that we can think about the difference between act and rule utilitarianism. Right? So in some instances, it might be the case that those two different ways of applying the greatest happiness principle lead to different conclusions about what ought to be done. So act utilitarianism says that what we ought to do is think about the consequences of every particular action that we're going to perform, and to worry about the consequences of those discrete actions and whether or not they maximize overall happiness. So answering the question, what ought I do? I have to think about the consequences of the individual actions. Right? Rule utilitarianism is a little bit different. It says what we ought to do is figure out which rules would maximize overall happiness if everybody followed those policies or followed those rules. And then regardless of whether others are actually following the rule or not, I ought to follow the rules that would maximize overall happiness if everyone followed them. So the rule utilitarianism says, okay, when you're trying to ask the question, what ought I do? What you got to do is think about the action, right? And what rule does the action follow under? Does it follow under a truth-telling rule, a promise-keeping rule, individual liberty rule? And then think about, well, what would the consequences be if everyone followed this rule? And would the consequences of the rule following maximize overall happiness or bring about more pain or harms? So slightly different ways of applying that utility principle there. So you might think about that also in regard to Unity's project, her assimilation project. So one of the consequences of utilitarianism, of course, is that it looks like it's open to this, that ends justify the means kind of criticism. So we need to worry about that. So here are some potential problems with utilitarian moral theory. Does it lead to counterintuitive conclusions about what we ought to do? If you're in agreement with utilitarianism, or you have the intuition that nothing is really intrinsically right or wrong, it's just right or wrong based on whether the consequences of the action are good or bad, then you might go along with some things that others might see as morally questionable. So for example, some moral theories claim that there are some actions that are inherently wrong and should never be done, even if they have good consequences. So there's a kind of objection to be leveled against utilitarianism there. If it were the case that killing this one innocent person would protect the lives of many more others, according to utilitarianism, that one person's got to go, right? So a bit of an issue there to worry about. Think about that with regard to killing baby Thanos or killing an innocent Hitler, the two thought experiments that we started off thinking about there at the beginning of this section. Another objection, predicting consequences can be difficult. So if we're trying to figure out what the best consequences would be, how to maximize hope or happiness over the long run, that gets pretty difficult to do. And then calculating happiness can be a problem here as well. Oftentimes utilitarians think more in terms of not what we could possibly do to bring about more happiness, but what can we do to just minimize pain, right? Another issue there for ACT utilitarians in particular, it looks like what utilitarianism demands is that what it demand of me is that I spend an awful lot of time calculating utility rather than actually doing anything that would minimize harm or bring about happiness. So there's a possible objection to ACT utilitarianism there, that rule utilitarianism would seem to take care of, maybe. So maybe that's a good reason for adopting rule utilitarianism as opposed to ACT utilitarianism. And then again, what we really need to worry about is that do the ends justify immoral means objections? We'll see that that seems to be the kind of objection that Summer offers against Unity's assimilation project. And it's the kind of objection that a respect for person or a deontological moral theorist might offer against utilitarianism as well. And so that wraps up this little lecture on utilitarianism. As always, make sure that you send me your questions by email or post them in the forum, and I'll address those as they come up. Otherwise, I hope y'all are all doing well and staying safe and washing your hands. Take care, and we'll see you at the next lecture.